So I should probably begin by defining expositional preaching. Another term for this is expository preaching. And this is essentially preaching that begins with the text and then just seeks to explain and apply it. That is the particular passage that's being addressed. And so this is in contrast to maybe a preacher who says, okay, I'm going to preach on this or that topic, and he maybe gathers a handful of scriptures to pair up with certain points. With expositional preaching, there's one passage that is really the driving force of the sermon. It determines what the sermon is going to be about. It determines what the sermon is going to be. And so we might say that with expositional preaching that the passage determines the points, when with topical preaching the points determine the passages. And so that is to say that the preacher has already decided what he's going to preach on, and he's going to gather some passages. And there's some choices that are made. He has to decide what he wants to address and what he doesn't want to address. There's a lot more freedom in topical preaching, and that may have its benefits, but there are certainly some dangers in that as well. I do think that topical preaching can be beneficial, and I preach topical sermons from time to time. But I believe that a steady dose of expositional preaching is one of the most very important things for building a healthy church. And that is because it really champions the authority and sufficiency of Scripture. And so, the purest form of expositional preaching is preaching through a book of the Bible, or at least through a larger section of Scripture. And so, especially whenever it's done this way, I think you can see how Scripture really is in the driver's seat, not just for each individual sermon, but even from week to week. So like right now, I'm preaching through Mark, and of course I look ahead and I know what's coming up, but as I sit down at the beginning of the week and I look at the passage that I'm going to preach on, I have no agenda of my own. I just want to see what the Word says, and that's what I'm going to preach. And so it really does champion the authority of Scripture and also the sufficiency of Scripture, that Scripture really is enough, that it really does give us all that we need for instruction and for training in righteousness, that we're equipped for every good work, as it says in 2 Timothy 3:16, right? All Scripture is God-breathed and is useful for all these things. And so if we really believe that, I think it's going to affect the way that we preach. Of course, we all want to say that we believe in the authority and sufficiency of Scripture, but the way that we preach is going to be telling. And that's one reason why I preach the way that I do, is just simply to show that Scripture is authoritative and that it's sufficient. Right? Just the very fact that I choose to preach expositionally, I think communicates this to the congregation. But then as we go from week to week and look at these passages, I believe that we really are able to hear from God in a special way, right? In a way that's much more powerful than if I were just to kind of, maybe throw some passages together and give my own thoughts on something, even if it's a biblically informed perspective. Ultimately, we want Scripture to be the driving force, and Scripture to take center stage and to be the authority in our preaching and of course in all of life. And so besides champion the authority and sufficiency of Scripture just in my choice to preach expositionally, I hope that as I do this, that I can also model for the congregation how they can maybe even from obscure passages and difficult passages draw out the meaning and application that God would have for us, because it's important that we don't just skip over passages that are difficult. That's true for our personal devotional life, but also in the life of the church. And so a benefit of especially of preaching through a book of the Bible is that I can't just pick and choose what I want to preach on. I can't skip over things that are difficult. If it's difficult to interpret or just difficult to accept, I must preach it. We must face it together. We must submit to it. And sometimes we just have to dig deep to even understand it. But it's worth it. It's worth it because Scripture really is authoritative and it really is sufficient.